Hi, it's Pastor Marlene. We continue with our Bible study on Exodus. Obviously, I'm recording these all the same day, so you get the same background and everything. But we're on chapter 20, and we're just going to take chapter 20 today because this is the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments can be numbered different ways, they can be interpreted different ways, and yet they certainly shape all of our faith, whether we're Christian or whether we're Jewish or even Muslim. All three traditions are going to depend on these basic laws for how and basic rule for how we live our life, how we relate to God, and how we relate to one another. So it's important to realize, first of all, that when you read through Exodus 20, or if you're reading through Deuteronomy 5, because you do have the Ten Commandments given again in Scripture, you're not going to get the same thing that you're going to see on a plaque plastered on your walls. You're not going to get number 1 with a Roman numeral, or even without a Roman numeral. And you're not going to get number 2 or number 3. It becomes 10 commandments because it is the Decalogue, the 10 words, 10 words. And so the sense is that there are 10 important statements. The problem is people number them. Well, there's lots of issues. Interpretation is another thing. But one of the big problems is we number them differently. So if you look at how Jewish people would number them versus how Roman Catholics number them, versus how Lutherans number them, versus how most Protestants number them, you're going to have controversy. So if you're going to argue about keeping a certain commandment by the number, you better double check what numbering system you're going by. Otherwise, you're going to be talking circles around each other. So in one sense, I think it's helpful for people to memorize the 10 Commandments. In another sense, just as soon as my confirmation students memorize the 10 Commandments, mom or dad is like, well, that's not right, because this one isn't the same as what I learned because they were brought up in a different denomination. Or they find somebody else who's memorizing them at their own church for confirmation or just for whatever, or they read, they go to the Christian bookstore and they read the 10 Commandments, and then we get all worked up because they're not the same. The reality is they're not numbered in Scripture. Even those verse numbers that we put in are verse numbers that we put in, and not you and I, but translators of Scripture. They're not originally there. That's an interpretation in itself, is where to put verse numbers so that everybody knows where you're at. Even where to put chapter numbers as far as that goes in Scripture. The Bible wasn't written chapter by chapter and verse by verse. Those are later edits. So keep that in mind when you read them. But there are also many, many different ways to interpret the Ten Commandments. In the Jewish sense, this is how you live out your life with God and with one another. Torah is law, not in the sense of lay down the law. It's in the sense of the way to real life, the way to have a full and abundant life, the way to be righteous with one another. Around one another and among one another. So they read it a little differently than you and I would read it. And in fact, even though we say the 10 Commandments, a Jewish person would start not with thou shalt or thou shalt not. They would start with, number 1, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, or, out of slavery, depending on what your translation is. But their first word is not do this or don't do this. For them, the first word is, who is God? God is the one who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. The Exodus story is so pivotal, such an important part of who the Jewish community is and how the relationship with God is related, that's how God is defined. the one who saved them from their slavery. So that's number one for a Jewish person. And then you would go from there and number down through 10. But like Lutherans do, they would say, "Thou shalt have no other God before you, and you shall not make graven images," is all one word. Because if you don't have any other gods before God, then you're not making any graven images. Now, most Protestants are going to separate those two. And I don't know any Christian community that starts without a commandment. We don't just have the 10 words, we have the commandments. So we have to start with, "You shall have no other gods before me." So that's number one. The question is, does that include graven images or not? I would say it does because I'm a good Lutheran. But many of you will hear number two, will have been exposed at least to somebody telling you that number two is, "You shall not make your graven images for yourself." But traditionally in Lutheran circles, we have, of course, followed Luther's Small Catechism, which gives us a different perspective on it because there are none of these commandments that you can keep if you really read Luther. And even if you read through the Small Catechism and you think, "Oh, maybe I still keep this one myself," then read through the Large Catechism. You'll definitely be convinced that you've broken all of them. And it's intentional. It's intentional to remind us that we cannot be righteous on our own. We need to turn to Christ. So the way we use the commandments is a reminder that no matter how good we try to be, no matter how much we try to live the life that God calls us to live, we can't do it on our own. We, in fact, need to have somebody intervene. And in our case, it's Christ intervening for us. So we would say the first 3 commandments have to do with our relationship to God. If you don't have any other gods, you don't have graven images either. But also, if you get that one right, you get all of them right. The problem is you never get that one right because we are to fear, love, and trust God above all things. And we often put other things, ourselves and other people, knowledge, science, other myths, all kinds of things before our trusting God. Money, wealth, power, any of those things can go before God. And as soon as something else goes before God, we're destined to break one or all 10 of the other ones. But the first table of the commandments, we traditionally say, are the first 3 commandments, all having to do with our relationship to God. So, don't have any other gods, don't make wrongful use of the Lord's name, but in fact, use the Lord's name properly in prayer, praise and thanksgiving to God, and remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And then the rest of them from number 4 on have to do with our relationships to other people. And now this is where we often think, "Oh, we don't break those commandments unless we're Lutheran, and then we know we do." But, almost every confirmation student I've had comes in thinking they haven't broken number 5. They haven't murdered anybody. They haven't killed anybody. Except if you read Luther's explanation, we are to fear and love God so that we neither endanger nor harm the lives of our neighbors, but instead help and support them in all of life's needs. So maybe we don't endanger anybody's life, although sometimes I drive a little too fast. I don't know that I've ever I probably have missed a stop sign at least once in my life without realizing it. Not intentionally, but, those are all times when I put somebody else's life in danger. But then to go even farther, we're supposed to help and support them in all of life's needs. There have often been neighbors, sometimes close by and sometimes far away, that I have not put their needs, taken their needs seriously and taken care of their needs. And so I've broken that one. I bet you have too. Adultery is the other one that, my confirmation kids, of course, they haven't committed adultery because they're not married. if they even understand what adultery is. But when we read Luther's explanation, we are to fear and love God so that we lead pure and decent lives in word and deed. And each of us loves and honors his or her spouse. Now, the loves and honors his or her spouse, I grant it, I haven't had any confirmation students yet that are married, so they're not falling in that sense. But we're to lead pure and decent lives in word and deed. And when we start to talk about our sexuality, we often use words or deeds that are not pure. Um, and I have yet to meet a seventh or eighth grader, and especially if you're doing confirmation in high school, who hasn't at least once had a problem with breaking that commandment in word or deed, either doing something that was profane, drawing something that was inappropriate, um, hopefully not getting out spray paint and doing it for the whole world to see. But we know some of them do that too. But in our words, not telling those crude jokes, not laughing at those crude jokes that when somebody else tells them, uh, not watching that raunchy stuff on TV, which I do watch because some of it's pretty good, but it doesn't, and it seems like even good shows now often have something that is certainly not living decent and pure lives. Uh, Apparently, that doesn't sell in American culture. And of course, I think thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet or covet the house or the neighbor's possessions. I think most of you can kind of get on board with most of those things. And, thou shalt not steal, remembering that it's even plotting to take something away. Or illegally downloading something or using an image that's copyrighted without permission to use it. That is all things that can be um, a way of stealing, or stealing time from your boss if you're supposed to be working on one thing and you're doing something else. There's all kinds of ways that we steal too. Bearing false witness to our neighbor, sometimes outright slander or gossiping about them, but sometimes it's other ways that we bear false witness. But ways, sharing something that might hurt their reputation. And in fact, and this is where it always gets me. We are instead supposed to speak well of our neighbor and interpret everything they do in the best possible light. Many times I look at what my neighbors, or sometimes what my members in the congregation are doing, or my family members, even more so, and I don't interpret it in the best light possible. I sometimes am very judgmental about what they're doing. And coveting, I think all of us have a sense of coveting. Now, sometimes we'll look at the 10th commandment as written in scriptures and we think, we're pretty good as long as we're not coveting the neighbor's wife, and I would say spouse, but of course at the time the wife was property. Don't get me started there. You'll just hear me go on for another 20 minutes and nobody wants to hear that. But the reality is, a woman was her father's property first and then her husband's property. We don't have to like it, but it was a reality. And but most of us don't have slaves or servants. Most of us today don't have ox or donkeys or, any of the livestock that's mentioned in scriptures. But all of us have neighbors that have maybe nicer TVs than we have, or nicer cars than we have, or who knows, even nicer lawn than we have in our neighborhood. So, when I read it, I certainly can understand that I've fallen short on every single one. But I want you to know that that is a very Lutheran interpretation. There are many people who read it and think they can live righteous lives because they can usually maintain these. And when they do break them, they can offer a sacrifice. Well, we don't do sacrifices anymore, but you can ask for forgiveness and move on and keep living a righteous life. And especially things like thou shalt not kill. I mean, the word in Hebrew really is murder. And most of us are not intentionally murdering anybody. So most of us don't come close to that in the original Hebrew. But again, I've got a Lutheran bias, so you hear my bias in it. But the point is to remember that when we read these, it's about how we can live. We gain life from God, the very giver of life. And when we have a deep connection to God, if we can follow those first three or first four, depending on how you number them, but if you can follow those first ones, those first words, and you know that God is with you, and you know and you trust in God, then you will have life. And you will also relate to your neighbor in a healthier, gentler, more gracious way. If you get the vertical relationship, the relationship between you and God right, you're going to get the horizontal relationship right. The relationship between not just the neighbors that you see, but everybody in the world. And but there are people who try to live it. It is life-giving, though. It's not meant to be taking away life. So as you read them, I hope that you can ponder them, but I also hope that they can be a model for how you live out your life. Now, the next one we're going to try is going to be live, so I don't know how that's going to go. And it's actually today. That's why I'm getting this done. So these will hopefully be uploaded. You will get links